I'd like to welcome you back to my channel if you're coming back, or if this is your first time. My name is Dale Hawthorne, and I want to speak to you on a subject which I've been thinking about this for like 40 or 50 years, and I never really made it a subject of in-depth study. I don't have a book or anything coming out of this, but talking about power and authority and limits to power and authority, especially in spheres like pastoral authority in the church, civil authority in the state, parental authority in the family, marital authority, and um, leadership in the marriage, and educational authority in our schools, our institutions. So I got a scripture up here which talks about being subject to, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution. It goes through authority and continues on through chapter 2 in 1 Peter, or chapter 2 here, continues on through chapter 3, talking about marital authority. And it's been said, and I believe it, that there has been a real problem with authoritarianism in the evangelical church over the past generation, perhaps before. I don't find some of the things which I hear about and hear people say in some of the older um, sermons, teachings, and so on. So I believe there has been a real abuse and misuse of authority and position, sometimes outright tyranny in these different spheres. I think it's due to people being given the opportunity to exercise authority without proper insight into their character and sometimes even their sanity, and especially due to, as people of the book, evangelicals, people who live by the Bible, or so we say, not recognizing scriptural limits to authority. So God has established authority. We're going to see it's there, right there in the scripture. So what are some of the things that we can talk about as far as limits to authority? Well, our earthly human authorities are limited by scripture, and we limit our obedience to them by scripture. If we're given an order to disobey scripture, we must refuse. And we do that not because we're being sassy, we're being defiant, or being disagreeable, but because we've got the higher authority of God himself in scripture, and we recognize that that human authority is responsible to God and will one day stand before God and give account for how they exercise authority. So we do need wisdom and guidance to understand what the scriptures have to say, both about possession of authority, exercise of authority, and misuse of authority, and limits of authority also. We need to study and apply scripture sensibly, and we need wisdom to understand the situations when higher authorities than we are clash with the other authorities which may exist and which may have established lines of authority and responsibility. This is something which you'll find if you have ever looked into just war theory, that a just war really and a revolution under the highest legitimate authority. So people are permitted revolution, especially under the highest limited authority that they have. Like the colonists in the United States justified their revolution in following civil authority as often as they could. So we need to be reminded also, when the scripture talks about being subject, submitting, it's not subjugation. It's not coerced either. It's our doing it for the Lord's sake, recognizing his authority over all earthly authority. And the use of force is not authorized except with civil authority. For pastoral authority, for parental authority, for marital authority, educational authority when dealing with adults, the use of force to enforce submission, subjugation, coercion, is the use of fraud also. I'll put that in there too. Use of force and fraud is not justified. They do not have any standing before God to lie, to misuse their authority, to punish physically, if especially the civil authority too comes under fraud. So in the face of authority, we often have to personally assert our rights, and necessary to do that often enough. But that's no justification if we're before authority that's misusing authority, the person in authority is misusing your authority, is no justification to habitual, defiant, and sassy attitude or being automatically disagreeable. To a certain extent, talking about submission talks about being agreeable where we can be easily agreeable and readily agreeable. Means that we don't see every chance time that authority is giving directions that we automatically rebel against that. That's what Scripture is talking about right here. And authorities do have to be limited on earthly authorities by common sense and reason to a certain extent. Such as there's no way that a husband can command his wife to go around and play in heavy traffic, or a civil authority, a parental authority, but even in the military, there may be cases where they may need to ask people to be prepared to give the ultimate sacrifice, but that's often not given as an order but as a request and put upon them with the utmost seriousness. There's a case in Babylon 5 where Bruce Boxleitner, who I respect greatly as a person, as an actor who played Commander Sheridan, had to ask Commander to go out to be prepared to give the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the war that they had going on then. And it's a scene which still moves me very deeply to this day. And we do have, I believe, it is a positive good, a positive responsibility under God, under Scripture, to protest unjust and illegal treatment. Jesus did that at his trials. When he was struck, he protested. When he was arrested with basically clubs and swords, like pitchforks and torches, like in the old Frankenstein movies, he protested. Paul also protested when he was treated unjustly compared to his rights as a Roman citizen, his civil rights. He asserted his civil rights. So I believe, these are some of the limits that we can find in Scripture. People's actions, people's examples, and certainly in this fallen world we'll find that sometimes malicious, egomaniacal, even insane people get to places of authority. We can talk about some of the real examples from history. Caligula, Gaius Caesar, Caligula, Nero, who there's been a strange attempt by one psychological author to rehabilitate him, but no, you go back to Suetonius, Tacitus, and the others, they had access to the immediate sources. They didn't know him personally, but they had access to sources which this guy didn't have. And yes, Nero was insane, grew more insane. Caligula probably had a brain disease which came upon him after a little while, which caused his insanity. And unfortunately they had no way under the emperorship in Rome to remove him. But continuing onward, there really can be a question of sound mind and a person in authority to limit their authority. That's why we have the amendment in the Constitution of the United States to remove a president who is not in possession of his faculties. And there's also a place for real self-defense against the misuse and abuse of authority. Escape is the first alternative, especially if the authority is murderous. David and Saul, 1 Samuel, we see it right there. So, and a limit to authority is also there needs to be a limit of fairness and justice when they deal with disputes between people. When people are having a disagreement, even a very heated, strong, passionate, violent disagreement, they need to be fair and consider all sides. They need to listen to both carefully, try to understand both. And this is one of the things I've often seen, that when we have disagreements with each other in the church nowadays, manipulative people will try to make authorities their partners in their personal jihads. They will try to make the flying monkeys, narcissists, do that, and they're very good at that often. And we need to recognize limits of authority include falsehood, insanity, injustice, misapplication of the law. And there's no justification in Scripture for misuse and tyranny in these spheres. As a matter of fact, God himself says throughout the scriptures that he will call them to account. There's judgment in this time for many of them, but ultimately all will stand before him and give account for the way that they've exercised their authority. And something I do want to emphasize, as evangelicals, as people of the book, people who submit to the authority of God through the Bible above all, we do not issue fatwas or promote jihad against others. In our churches, in our personal lives, if we believe that someone has wronged us, we do not return evil for evil. Right? We follow what Scripture says there. We promote forgiveness where possible, reconciliation where possible. We promote love as possible. I'll have more to say on that eventually. I'm going to be talking about Jesus' revolution against the unfairness of the world. One of those is his revolution of forgiveness. So, continuing on now with some of the different spheres and types of leadership. Talking first of all with pastoral leadership, church leadership. Our responsibility is as pastors to use the scriptures, to use our authority. If we truly look at it from scripture, see that we have authority, to use the scriptures to build up. We don't tear down people. The Apostle Paul said that explicitly. 2 Corinthians 13:10, a verse which I've never heard a pastor quote in personal life or from the pulpit. But it is a limit on authority. We use our authority to build up, not to tear down. And also, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 24, another scriptural limit on authority within the church. We don't use it to lord it over anyone's faith, to act as master to anyone. That's what it means, to act as master over anyone as to what they do in following the Lord impersonally, but to work together. And this really does mean that we give and allow choices according to the Word. We set before people what the Word says. There's a video by Paul Washer. I'll try to find it and put in the link in the comments if I can, but he was called aside by an elder. He was a missionary in, I believe, somewhere in Latin America, perhaps Peru, and there were a number of people coming to him. He said, your responsibility isn't to tell them what to do. Share the scriptures with them, go over the scripture if you're in their personal ministry. And that's what personal ministry as a pastor really is. Not standing up, trying to micromanage others' lives, or personal and probably false prophecy. A lot of beatings which people give as leaders are probably false prophecy. If you look at them, they're probably false. If you look at them carefully, according to the scriptures. We're to guide people from the word rightly interpreted. We're people of the Reformation, right? Evangelical churches, generally Protestant churches, we go back to Martin Luther, who will not be persuaded, who will stand upon scripture and upon reason. So, and this is why we see Jesus giving his correction to the Pharisees a lot of times. A lot of times he's correcting them from the scriptures themselves. If we look at them carefully, we can see that. And our pastorate, our place of leadership in the church is servanthood. It's not because we're special, but we're held to extra responsibility, and God will give us the ability to hold that responsibility. But we're not special in ourselves. The gift of leadership is a gift from God. We're put in that place by God, called by him, by God to issue his scripture. We're called to have the elder qualities as listed in 1 Timothy and Titus. 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1. And the discipline of elders, we are under discipline ourselves. We should be, at least by the congregation, if not by an outside denominational authority, where the congregation, because there can be cases such as small churches where the board are primarily the lackeys of the pastor and do not recognize or discipline a pastor for grievous and egregious abuses of scripture and of people. So disciplines come by correction. It can be a sabbatical for a pastor to get his life together. And abusive pastors, you do have to recognize that you may need to be removed from your pastorate. You may lose the support of the church at that time. You may have to go out to vocational ministry. Accept that if you're being abusive of people. That normally happens for sexual misconduct, but it should be happening, I think, more for pastors who find themselves in abuse. Well, someone might say at this point, well, I mean, half the pastors, well, I would say maybe possibly 10% should be under this kind of scrutiny. So, again, expect and advise where our guidance is to give guidance by the Scripture, and expect others to advise them to examine your preaching and teaching by the Scripture themselves. It's their adult advisement to look at that, consider what you have to say, and follow what the Scripture has to say. And that brings it back to the authority is God, and they're conscious before God, their responsibility before Him. You're standing as a messenger of God, sharing the Scripture with them, but their responsibility is to God. And certainly, people in the congregation need to be advised. There's no justification if they're giving unreasonable doubt or disagreeableness when they're faced with the Scripture, because the Scripture is what God says. I've seen people in the right congregation. I think that very often I would share something from the Scriptures with them, and they would have this doubt. Well, it's the Scriptures. And one of the problems we do have also when we talk about authority, which there are people, they tend to be women, from my experience, but I do believe that there are some guys will take authorities as a Scripture and expect others to bow down to their favorite authorities without giving that person the chance to examine and see whether what that person says is according to the Scripture, or if you disagree with that person, they'll still expect that person to obey their favorite authorities. I remember back in the 1980s when Focus on the Family had Dr. Dobson in the lead place there, and every time he'd release a new book, I said it, and a number of people laughed at it, that husbands fear when Dr. Dobson releases another book, because their wives are going to read it and come home and expect them to obey it without even giving them a chance to read it. And I actually advised people in that time, don't do that. Let them read it first. And don't expect them to bow down to it, even if you agree with it, because it has to be their agreement with what that says according to the Scripture. So there's some other things I've seen that have, over the years, have happened kind of strangely. Pastors often overestimate their authority or overestimate what, especially people they just happen upon, fellow believers they might happen upon. Walking into a church service as a visitor doesn't give a pastor automatic authority over that person, especially someone who's a member or an adherent to another church fellowship. That person has put their membership in another church, and if they just visit your church for whatever reason, maybe they're on vacation, maybe they're there with a friend or a special, that doesn't give you authority over them to, and especially not a continuous and lasting authority. When they walk out the door, let them go. Don't try to rope them into stuff. Those of you who've done this, you know what I'm talking about. And when someone leaves your church, the line of authority over them is broken. And I don't advise that to a lot of times, but it may be the only option if there's constant misuse and abuse of authority. Pray for the person, leave them alone. If this is your church, if they're doing that. Avoid any pretensions of them being at fault. You may not know the whole story. You may not even be the person who caused the break. Avoid sharing concerns about that person behind their back. Remember, we as evangelicals do not issue fatwas against people. We do not sponsor jihads against people who may have attended our church at some time. We do not wage war against those who may have some sort of disagree with us, or who may walk away from fellowship for reasons that may be justified or we may be considered unjustified. We don't issue fatwas or sponsor jihads. So, next sphere of authority is the civil authority, the sphere of the town, the city, the tribe, the state, the nation. Definitely, our civil authority should be supportive of the acts of responsible adulthood, such as marriage, child employment, honesty in business, suppression of violence. They're authorized to punish violence and fraud. The general limits in Old Testament law for the civil authority, if you look at the civil law of Israel, is the Ten Commandments. So civil authority also does give limits to pastoral authority, in some situations parental and spousal authority against violence, right? For pastors, there is no permission to break law just simply because you claim that you have pastoral authority. I don't think we can find that. We break upon script, we disobey upon Scripture. If authorities are telling us to disobey Scripture and our conscience before God, just like Martin Luther, not because we think that we're a pastor and our authority overrides civil law. It doesn't. And there's been some sloppiness I've seen over my lifetime with pastors with HIPAA laws in the United States in regard to referrals and counseling and confidentiality. Some real sloppiness, I think some real places where they've crossed the line into illegal activity. Make sure that you understand these. I'll plan to put a link in the comments about this. And civil disobedience to civil authorities. There are some real examples in Scripture. If they attempt to instigate or coerce idolatry, you find that in Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their civil disobedience is the example to us. Attempt to sponsor false religion upon sponsor disobedience to Jesus himself. Peter and John, Acts chapter 4, verses 1 through 22. And against oppressive government, we look at what Scripture gives judgment against oppressive government for. And certainly, as believers, we can flee persecution from a civil government. We can go from one town to another, as Paul did in his ministry in Acts chapter 13, 14, especially when he fled from one city to another in the Galatian churches. And Jesus did command just exactly that in Matthew 10. So, that's about civil authority, employment. Give people, the bosses, respect, managers respect according in obedience with the limitations again of Scripture, common sense, reason. I've seen too much over the years people trying to apply the master-slave relationship to people in modern employment situations. We don't have that legal sanction of disobedience of ownership, which was permitted and highly limited under the Old Testament law. We don't have that in our modern North American world. And I pray if you're in a country hearing this which does still have slavery, Lord, free the people there. It's not extremely applicable except respect and obedience as far as it goes under the legal obligation. Employer-employee relation is mentioned even in the parables of Jesus as being an adult agreement for working for the person, for wages, and the providing your labor for an employer. So I don't think we've had nearly enough understanding of that in our age, where our obligation is for legal employment, how to be honest. I do say that Scripture says honest day's work for an honest day's wage, and if the employer is generous with us, so be it. Or in the standards, generally we do have that employment agreement, and even under the Old Testament, if we're talking, just to mention slavery very briefly, legal separation was permitted, and we can have transitions from our employment as long as we're being honest, upfront, and dealing with the employer face to face as much as possible. And we got agreed upon wages and terms of service. Even Jacob and Laban abused Jacob in that situation. Scripture is very plain about it. Jacob protested that to him legitimately, and that was agreed upon for wages and also a service for his daughters. So their standards there, they're honorable limits, agreed upon conditions that are possible. And we and when Jacob left Laban, the problem wasn't that he left, but the problem was that Jacob did so with deception as to his future intentions, and it's the stealth and Rachel stealing the idols of Laban. So that's in the book of Genesis. And we can witness as freedom of speech pretty much in our job and under employment. Even in North America, that's not illegal. We don't lose our First Amendment rights when we go on the job. We do be honest about it. We don't steal from the employer to take time away, especially to witness to people without his permission. In our cases, and we share the gospel perhaps where it's appropriate. Maybe go outside, maybe ask someone to lunch or something like that. But we seek to fulfill our legal and ethical obligations under God as much as possible. So, parental authority, a sphere of family authority. No person who's been a parent or within the church has the right to claim authority over another adult as a parent. I've had people try to claim authority over me when I was younger, 65 now, and that they are a parent to someone else, and I'm the same age. So no, they weren't my real parents. My real parents were alive at that time, and I believe fully that that doing that would have forced me to disobey the commandment to honor your father and mother. I would have been giving honor to someone who wasn't my father and mother at that point. And certainly, abuse of authority and physical and sexual abuse is a legitimate civil crime. There is a limit there under civil law, very legitimately, for physical and sexual abuse. What we would call physical and sexual abuse from a parent nowadays, that actually was illegal under Old Testament law. It's not spelled out as much as it is in modern law, but it would be illegal also. And obedience to a parent would give respect after we come of age, but our obedience is limited by when we come to age, when we come to adult responsibility in marriage. And it's interesting, there's a passage in Numbers chapter 30 which talks about vows, which I've never seen this mentioned in any of the talking about authority, but there are limits given as to the responsibility for a vow or who can nullify a vow. Fathers can nullify the vow of a young woman who's living in her father's household. So, obedience, the father had that kind of authority in that situation, but after marriage, if she was married to a husband, if husband knew about a vow that she had taken when they were married, he could nullify it too. He had that kind of authority. So after widowhood or divorce, the woman would have been responsible for her vow, whether there's a father or husband, ex-husband saying anything about it. She had the responsibility. So that indicates there is a limit to authority there. Widowhood or divorce, authority of the husband's gone, authority of the father's gone. In verse 10 talks about, in Numbers chapter 30, when she's living with the husband does have the authority to nullify. So it's talking about limits of authority here in this passage, which it does talk about different capabilities, right, for exercising authority right there. I've never seen this really addressed, and I think it really does need to be, because it shows that the authority which was carried over in the New Testament for parents and also in the marriage, that was limited legally and sensibly under Old Testament law. So parental authority, it's part of responsibility, and I think that we've often suffered in our day because I've known that there have been children, even well into adulthood, who've had parents who've tried to dominate them, even after they've been married. Self-appointed matriarchs and patriarchs who try to lord it over their husband, their daughter, their son, and their spouses too. They're a separate household at that point. They respect, yes. Obedience. Obedience is limited. For a man leaves his father and mother's and becomes one flesh with his wife at that point. So this does bring us down to marital leadership. I'll have some more to say on this. Responsibility for both sides, husband and wife, is Christ-likeness. That's what it's talking about. Physical abuse is legitimate civil crime. It's assault, according to the Old Testament, right? And fraud, lying, deception, that's also crime and against the Old Testament, right? Thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not slander, thou shalt don't lie, right? And adultery and desertion in the Old Testament also. The standard of civil righteousness is scriptural grounds for divorce in the New Testament. I do have a writing about that, and grounds for breaking and dissolution of marriage is end of marital authority. The husband to a divorced wife does definitely not have the place of headship, according to what I just went over in Numbers chapter 30, verse 10, verses 8, 9, and 10. So, separation is a possibility there, but that would mean a suspension of authority. Therapeutic separation, which does seem to be contemplated in 1 Corinthians 7. So that would mean the husband at that point has authority suspended for that time. So there's a lot we can go into here more, and we're doing a lot of discussion on it in the churches now. But I just want to say that there is a real limit according to Scripture, according to common sense, and according to criminal law nowadays, and in the Old Testament also. So last sphere of authority, educational, which I don't see this that much in Scripture at all. But we have built up in our North American culture, and it was known in the ancient culture too, educational institutions, schools. Not everyone was able to go to school then, but I think literacy, there was a lot more literacy than some modern authors have been willing to understand. But we do have our evangelical seminaries, colleges, and schools also. So we can't really take the old phrase in loco parentis, in place of the parent, too seriously, too far, definitely, in our educational institutions. And we must recognize that when a person is an adult, the authority is extremely limited, whatever there may be. I'm not quite sure exactly what the limits would be, except that the expectation of Scripture for someone, for one believer to another. And certainly some of those who teach in our institutions may have credentials as elders in the church, may be teaching elders, may be serving as elders in the church, even if they're definitely not a pastor. If the elders are ordained, they need to receive respect and need to act according to 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, the qualifications there. And we need to recognize that they don't have the authority as someone who's preaching and teaching, as someone who's part of the church, part of their church, their normal church, where they're a member, where they're an adherent, where the Scripture would have authority. Otherwise, they would have authority due for respect, being subject under 1 Peter right here, chapter 2, verse 13, be subject to the Lord's sake for every human institution. We could probably put in some way a teacher there in school, yeah, for a child in school, we're responsible for respect and obedience as much as possible. They can't tell us that what to believe if it's contrary to Scripture, contrary to parental authority. But I think that we do need to remember, we don't want to do anything that would give our kids permission to disobey upon their own orneriness, disagreeableness, rebellion, not to be the rebellious child. And in our educational institutions, where we're, the people who are teaching there are responsible to evaluate what they teach according to Scripture, logic, and common sense, and so on. Whatever may be the standards in their field, generally agreed upon standards. Simply be responsible for what you're teaching. Examine it, and if your opinions change, communicate that. Deal with that according to the standards of the ethics in the institution and the field also. And also expect others to examine your teaching by the Scripture, logic, common sense, historical reality, and so on. Don't deal with a difference of opinion as automatically being disrespectful. Take questions legitimately. Be as gracious as you can. And recognize when a person graduates, you don't have authority afterwards. They're not your students anymore. Don't call them such. Don't treat them such. Recognize that they've passed on to what they're being prepared for in that institution in the first place. And definitely, if you're in a college, university, seminary level, you are not responsible for making any adult decisions for students or interfering in their adult lives after graduation. You may have opinions. You may find yourself in a position to offer advice, but do not interfere in their lives afterwards. I've seen some abuses in this also. Don't complain about your students after graduation to anyone. Allow for whatever happened to be in the past to be in the past. They may come back and apologize. They may not if there were disagreements. But don't dig it up, anything there, to prejudice others against them in the future. I've seen that happen in the past also. The people who did it are now with the Lord, and they've answered to Him for that. But remember, if people attend our institutions, we do not issue fatwas or promote jihad against fellow students, even if we disagree. We make our disagreements plain and loving and allow for them to come to their senses, or maybe we need to come to our senses perhaps, right? We may need to come to our senses. But we do not issue fatwas or promote jihad against former students. There is no license for that in the Scriptures. You know what I'm talking about. Holy war of slander, blackballing people, etc. We do not do that. And anyone in an institution who does that, that's a case where they need people who are responsible for ethics and privacy in those institutions need to call them to account. So, last thing. Speaking primarily to pastors, but to those in authority also, look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. About the humility of Jesus. Don't pursue your position as if you're someone special. Look also at Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 27, where Jesus talks about exercise of authority, not like the Gentiles, where he talks about servanthood. Also, Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 28, where there was a case where a mother tried to get Jesus to do a little bit of what we would call nepotism toward her sons, James and John. Jesus refused and put upon them their ability to follow him. So, people may have their reasons to leave our situation. Hopefully it's because moving on, marriage, going to another place, another job, let them go. If they have reasons we disagree with, let them go. So, this whole subject, I think, there needs to be more consideration, more study among our churches, but I think if we look at what is there in the Scriptures as far as the limitations, preach and teach the limitations, as well as the talking about people for obedience to people. Hebrews 13 has a couple verses also, which I put in the comments. We need to look at this and make sure that we're exercising our authority in a way which is godly, which honors the Scripture, which honors human ethics, which we're doing things rightly before human beings as much as possible. If we've misused our authority, if we need to confess and apologize to people. I've done that in the past. If I've thought that I've done that, if I've been, sometimes God has convicted me. If I've been persuaded, and there are people who've done that to me in the past, confess before God first of all. I would advise you, if you're in a position of authority at this point, do a moral inventory of your position, of what you've done from beginning to end. Pastor, if you're a professor, if you're a teacher, husband, civil authority, a moral inventory of what you're like, how you've exercised that according to God. Confess before Him first of all. If you have misused your authority, you may need to speak to some people, apologize. If you're observing someone in authority in the position where you are, breaking legal and ethical guidelines and breaking them chronically and egregiously and encouraging others to do so, you should speak up. Find some way to deal with that, with the proper authorities over them, to bring them to line. Because I think that if we look at it, we may find that many of the people who left our churches did so because of misuse of authority. You'll find in the play talking about family authority, parental authority. We hear a lot about over control of children, and when they get out, they go crazy. So let's look at this, consider it, pray about it, and let's do what we can to follow Jesus, honor God, and be His people in this world. And I think revival will come to many in positions of authority if they look at their lives, and they may have entered it legitimately, maybe not. But they may need to leave if they've entered it illegitimately, if they're exercising it for their own ego. If they come to grips with that before God, we may see revival starting from the people in those places of authority. Most often in our day, we find it not coming from people in authority. We find it from the people, the rank and file. Someone gets a renewal, starts testifying to what God has done in their lives, but we usually don't find it coming anymore through people in authority. And I think that if we look at how authority has been exercised, we may find the reason. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been a blessing to you. God bless.